Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 in the object-oriented programming video series. So in the last lecture we learned about objects and how everything in Python is an object, and you can check the object type using the type function. So now we want to know, how do we make our own objects in Python? And that's where the class keyword is going to come into play. So user-defined objects are created using this class keyword, and you can think of class as almost like a blueprint that defines the nature of a future object. And then from these classes we can construct instances. And an instance is going to be a specific object created from a particular class. So if you remember in this above example here in the Jupyter notebook, we created a list called L, and so L was an instance of a list object. So let's go ahead and hop over to the live coding to create a very simple example of a class. So we put the class keyword and then whatever your name of the class you want to be. So in this case we're going to have a sample be the name of our class. And by convention, class names are capitalized, unlike function names which are lowercase. And then we pass in this parameter object. And I'll explain that in a later lecture because that actually has to do with how Python was developed to begin with. But for right now, just remember, whenever you're making a class, you have the keyword class, the name of the class, and then you type in object as a parameter that you pass through. And this, as far as this white space syntax, this should look pretty familiar and similar to functions. And then all we're going to do for class is just pass. Okay, and that's our very first class. So let's go ahead and make an instance of our sample class by calling sample, and there you have it. And so now X is, if we check its type, whoops, its type is main sample, which basically tells you that it's a sample class type. So like I said, by convention we give classes a name that starts with a capital letter, and now right here we have X, which is a reference to a new instance of a sample class. In other words, we instantiate the sample class. Inside the class, we currently have pass. But what we're going to do now is define attributes and methods. So if we hop back over to the Jupyter notebook, there's two things we can do within a class. Put in an attribute and put in a method. An attribute is a characteristic of an object, and a method is an operation we can perform with the object. So we've already seen methods, and we've actually already dealt with attributes, you just didn't know it yet. And to show this, we're going to create an example class called dog. So for instance, an attribute of a dog may be its breed or its name, while a method of a dog may be defined by like a bark method, which returns some sort of printed sound out. Okay, so let's go ahead and get a better understanding of attributes through an example. And the syntax for attributes is going to look a little something like this. It's going to be self dot the name of the attribute, and then you set it equal to something. And there's a special method called init underscore underscore init underscore underscore parentheses, and that's going to allow us to basically initialize or instantiate the attributes of an object. So the syntax is going to look like this, what I have here in the cell, and I'm going to go ahead and live code it and break it down for you. So let's go ahead and create a dog class. So I start with my class keyword, capital letter, dog, and then I pass in object. Basically, you can think of that as Python telling it, oh, you're making an object. That's not exactly what's happening there. It's a little more complex than that. But for right now, you can just think of it that way. And now we start with a method. And when you put a function inside of a class, you refer to them as methods. And this underscore underscore init is known as a special method. And that's because it's going to initialize the attributes of a class. And every single method within a class is going to have the word self in it. S-E-L-F, self. And something I want you to keep in mind is we've already used the term method before. You can remember when we had lists, we had methods such as count, like we saw in the last lecture. So what's basically happening right now is you're making methods for your own object that you're creating. Now, this underscore underscore init underscore underscore is what's known as a special method, and it's going to allow us to put in attributes for our class. So right now, I'm going to create this class, dog, take an object, and I create this first method, and what I'm going to do is create an attribute called breed for the dog. Self.breed, and I'm going to set it equal to breed. Go ahead and run that, and then create an instance of dog with the breed equal to lab. And now if I check what Sam is, main dog, great. So now let's fully break down what we just did above. So we start with class, the name of the class, and then we input object. After that, we start constructing our methods, which basically look like functions, but since they're within a class, we call them methods. And we have this special method, this underscore underscore init underscore underscore, and it's called automatically right after the object has been created. So remember, this will always be your first method when you're creating your classes. And as you create classes, you'll see why. So each method in the class definition begins with a reference to the instance object. And what that means is you always start with this self reference. That's by convention that you use that self keyword. It actually doesn't have to be self, but it's never not self. So always use self as the first argument for these methods. That basically tells you, hey, this method within your class is referencing dog first. Okay. And then when continuing off of that, each method in the class definition begins with a reference to the instance object. And like we said, by convention, that's self. So in this case, breed is the argument, and the value is passed during class instantiation. So we say self.breed equals breed. So when I'm creating that instance of the dog class, I can't just do dog, because in it needs an argument. And notice how it says it takes exactly 2 arguments, only 1 was given. But you might be thinking, hey, I actually gave it zero arguments. Well, that's not true, because self by default is given there because it lets that method know you're referencing that dog object. So then we say breed is equal to whatever you want it to be. And notice we're actually not checking that breed is a particular type of object. I could actually just pass a list there or a number, but here it makes sense that I want to breed. So let's go ahead and do another breed. Another breed of dog we can do is like a husky. So now Sam is an instance of this dog object type, and its breed, the attribute, is equal to husky. And it's referencing that attribute with the self.breed. And it's going to be equal to whatever you put in as breed there. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that Sam equal to dog. So this object label, Sam, references that dog object. And now, and this is why I stressed methods so much earlier in the course, so you can kind of draw the parallel here. I just did tab completes, and if I call breed on Sam, it returns husky. And notice how I'm not putting parentheses like we saw in some other methods. That's because this is an attribute of the object, not a method on the object. This init, or this def, and then whatever keywords you see here, those will be methods. But right now, self.breed is an attribute of the dog object. Okay. So in Python, there's also class object attributes, and those class object attributes are the same for any instance of the class. So I'll show you what I mean by that by creating a new class object attribute. So I'm going to place it right before any methods, class object attribute, and I'm going to make something called species mammal. Whoops. Okay, so notice right now I'm not saying self.species, I'm saying just species. And that's because if I put this outside and before this init method, it's going to treat it as what's called a class object attribute. And that means no matter what kind of dog object we make, its species is always going to be mammal, which makes sense, right? No matter what the breed of a dog is, it's always going to be a mammal. So if we go ahead and run that cell, now we have Sam, the dog. Its breed is still husky, but you'll notice now if I put tab here, it also has a species attached to it, and it's mammal. And that's what's known as a class object attribute. So now let's create some more attributes for this dog. So what else can a dog have? A dog can have a name. So then I'll pass a name when I start making the dog, and I'll say, okay, self.name is equal to whatever name I pass for that dog. So now if you notice, if I only pass husky, I'll get an error. Because now it takes 3 arguments and only 2 are given, self and breed. So now I'll put a name for my dog. And I'll name it the same label I was using. I'll name it Sammy. There you go. And now Sam, which is a dog object, is also going to have a name. Sammy, that string that's attached to it. Okay. And what I want you to again note is that the class object attribute, that species equals mammal, is defined outside of any methods in the class. And by convention, you always place them first before this init method. Okay, so I know we kind of went over a lot, and this is actually the end of this part 2 of object-oriented programming, the class keyword. So let's really break down everything that we just did. I'll hop back over to the completed Jupyter Notebook to make sure we understand what we did. So remember, when we want to create a new object type, we use the class keyword, we space, then we capitalize whatever we want the name of the class to be, and we pass an object as a parameter or an argument there, colon, and in this case we just did pass the simplest class or object type you can have. And then when you create an instance of it, you call the class, no arguments, and you can check its type and check that it's part of the class, that main sample. Okay, so that's how we create classes. And remember, classes can basically have attributes and methods. So we've already seen the ways we can create attributes. And there's a special method which we'll always do when we're creating a class called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And that's going to allow us to initialize the attributes of the object. So it's always going to be first as far as your first method. Now we also saw class object attributes, such as the species here, and those come first if you decide to have them even before that init method. They're not always necessary, but if you do decide to have these class object attributes, then you will use them. Okay, so moving back up here, we say def, so it basically follows all the same syntax as a function, and you can almost think of it as a function, except that since it's inside a class, it's called a method, because it's a method on that class object. Underscore underscore init, we pass in self, and then you start passing in whatever you want the attributes to be. So we saw breed in this particular example, and then back here we also passed in name. And just to drive the point home a little further, maybe I say fur, and I can have fur be a Boolean or something. Maybe I always say, okay, in most cases, dogs have fur, so I can actually set these just like we did for functions. I can set default argument. So I'll say self.fur is then equal to fur. And by default, fur is actually always equal to true. So that means when I run this, I actually don't have to pass it. And if I check if my dog has fur, you'll notice it equals true. Now I could have passed fur equals to false. First, let's say for some reason this dog didn't have fur, and now fur is equal to false. So as far as the syntax and convention here, this should feel very similar to functions, The main difference being this self, the fact that you're creating attributes off of these input arguments. And the reason we're using self here instead of just like breed equals breed is because due to scope, Python needs to know, hey, are you actually referencing some global variable breed, or do you want me to set this dog's object attribute self.breed equal to that breed input? Okay, so I encourage you to play around with this particular class right here, this dog. Make up at least one or two more attributes. Make sure you fully understand, and I also want you to set a new class object attribute that would be true for all dogs. Okay, so make sure you fully understand how we set attributes using this special method, this init method. And coming up next, we'll look into methods more broadly, just as functions defined within the body of a class. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture.